Hey guys, welcome to week 5. This week we're digging into chapter 3, which is the arrival of the Persian court culture and the spread of Islam into India. So I'm not here to make you guys Buddhist, I'm not here to make you guys Hindus, I'm not here to make you Muslims, but I do want to give you a little bit of information about Islam and what it means to be a Muslim. So I'm just going to give you some really basic information really quick. So Islam is the submission to God, and that would be one God, and that one God's name is Allah. Now this differs greatly from the previous two religions we've discussed. Buddhism has no God, Hinduism has innumerable gods, and now we're looking at a religion with one God. Muhammad was the founder of Islam and revered as its final prophet. He is the one who received messages from the Archangel Gabriel, and he received these messages in 610. And it was about one and only God, Allah. But this caused quite a bit of opposition in his birthplace, the city called Mecca. And that is because Mecca was a caravan town, and it was pagan. Pagan means a belief in multiple gods, which goes against the belief in one God. So he fled to Medina, and he returns to Mecca in 622. And that's when we see Islam dating its beginnings from that flight, they call it, of 622. It's known as the Hijra. Muhammad returns to Mecca with in 630 with 10,000 soldiers, and that's when Islam really starts to spread. I'm going to show you a map here, and all the areas that you see in green is where Islam spread in the year 1500, which would translate to 900 Hijra. Remember, one Hijra is the beginning of the dating, and that's equivalent to 622. That won't play a big role for us, so don't worry about it. All the dates you see in our book are going to be dates that we're familiar with in our calendar. I want to mark off a couple of key locations on this map. Mecca, again, birthplace of Muhammad. He went to Medina. This is where he gathers 10,000 soldiers and eventually goes back to Mecca and spreads his belief in one God. Now, as you can see, Islam spread. And one of the areas that is most important for us to understand today is the spread of Islam into Iran. And that is because the first Iranians in the east to conquer Delhi in India, they're the ones who bring Islam to India. So that's why it's specifically today Iran is important. Now, Iran has a whole history of tradition and art forms, and so we'll see those influences, and I'll discuss those as we go through. However, since we are in India, we'll also continue to see Indian influences, both in subject and style. So subject is what we're looking at. Style is the way it looks, just based on looks. Now, there are 5 obligations that bind all Muslims: profess in one faith, Allah, worship 5 times a day, give alms to the poor, fast during the month of Ramadan, and then once in a lifetime, if possible, pilgrimage to Mecca, and your reward is paradise. But worshiping 5 times a day is what I want to talk about specifically now. You don't, as a Muslim, have to go to the mosque to pray, although mosque architecture is closely associated with prayer. So I want to talk about a couple of key architectural elements you'll notice as you look at some of the Islamic buildings in India. First and foremost, we have the minaret. Minarets are towers which the faithful are called to worship. So these are very functional. They're meant to function that somebody goes up a column or a tower and they call out for prayer 5 times a day. The Qibla wall is a specific wall in mosque architecture which faces towards Mecca, and that's where Muslims face while praying. And in that wall is a mihrab, which is the shape of a semicircular niche, and it's symbol for the place where the Prophet stood. So all of this becomes standard in the house of worship for Muslims, which is the mosque. So I'm going to talk about a structure here. This is in the Great Mosque of Kairouan in Tunisia. So it's not in India, just make that clear. But I want to talk about here the minaret. Now it said that part of this might be part of an old Roman lighthouse, but the top of it here with the high windows and the dome shape and the high windows is typical of Islamic architecture. So remember, this minaret is where Muslims would be called to prayer 5 times a day. It also marks the entrance to the mosque structure. There's a large courtyard and then the entryway. And over the entryway is a dome, another dome, again, typical of mosque architecture. And then you can also see on the exterior another dome, which really marks the spot of the mihrab, and that's on the Qibla wall again. So this is the wall here, which faces Mecca, and so Mecca would be in that direction. So when we go to India, remember, we have the Ghurids. They are the ones who set up rule and conquer India and then bring Islam with them. And they're again from Iran. So they start to build a mosque, and this is called the Qutb Minar. And so you can see this really tall minaret. It's about 238 feet tall. Now remember, these minarets functioned to call Muslims to prayer. Do you think that this makes a lot of sense to have a 238-foot tower for somebody to climb 5 times a day? And then not only that, if somebody did climb this 5 times a day, do you think you could actually hear them call Muslims to prayer? Because of the size of this, it would not actually function the way it would originally be planned. So what this really symbolizes is the victory of Islam, the triumph of Islam, and really victory of Islam in Delhi. It's like a monument to victory. So that's why it is built so tall. So the size and proportion specifically reflects basically the Islamic conquest of India, the triumph of Islam in India. You might also notice above the doorway also, there is a dome, typical of mosque architecture. When you are in a mosque, in any kind of a religious mosque setting, you will not see human forms or human figures or even animals. It is against Islamic belief to have living humans or animals in a religious architectural setting. So what you end up seeing is what you see on this particular screen, this intense ornamentation. We often call it arabesques. What you see here is lettering, Arabic lettering on the side, and then you also see these plant-like forms and tendrils and flowers, and sometimes they become quite abstract in style, but we can still tell that they're some type of a plant form. Now, another type of medium that becomes really significant in Islam, and specifically here in India, is manuscript paintings. And that is because there is a long history of storytelling in Iranian culture. And so this is actually a page from a book called the Shahnameh, which is a story that's being told. And in this particular page, we're seeing the story of Rustam, who's a hero, and I'll show you who he looks like. He looks like he's wearing this like blue-colored chainmail, and he is killing the white div. Now, div means devil. But what's interesting about this particular image of this devil is it does not look like a devil the way we would understand a devil would look. So I'm going to show you a page from Iran that also depicts this exact same scene, but you're going to see what it looks like in Iran. So here the devil, as Rustam is attacking him, looks like a beast. Really, he looks like a devil. He looks like something scary, right? So here in India, when we have these Iranian rulers and they're depicting stories from their homeland, you start to see a mix of styles. So some of the plant forms that you see here, and I'll talk about this in another page. It's a type of stacked perspective. I'll talk about it in another page. I'm going to show you in just a moment. That's typical of Iranian manuscripts. The red background, however, that you see, the flat colored red background, that's typical of India artwork and India influence. So back in chapter 2, when you read about some of the manuscripts from the Jain religion, you would see that red background, and you'd also see these large eyes like we see here on the devil as well. So those are the Indian influences. Also, the body of the devil looks fairly sensuous. And again, that sensuality is something that we see since the very beginning of our class in India. We see the sensual form of bodies. Another type of manuscript that they had created was one talking about food and eating certain types of food. So this page is titled The Enjoyment of Betel. So that story is again from Iran. And here's the thing. This story of telling, the history of telling stories and narrating stories there's a long tradition of that in Iran. And although we saw manuscripts with Buddhism and Jainism in the previous chapter, they were really religious in nature. This is more secular. Secular means non-religious. Now, stylistically, we have an Indian influence. Again, look at the shape of the bodies. The female bodies are very sensuous. And you also see the large eye as though it's looking straight out at us. It is not a natural perspective of an eye. Okay, now I want to mention really quickly the southern region of India called Vijayanagara. This city, the name of this city means City of Victory, and it's basically ruled by Hindu rulers, and it's south of the Deccan. And I'll show you a map and remind you guys when I showed you that large plateau area that sort of separates India. There are also Hindu rulers in a city called Madurai. They were called the Nayaks, and they were basically governors of Vijayanagara. So these two cities that I'm showing you on the map here, both are ruled by Hindu rulers, okay? And then there's the Deccan again, remember you guys. So this is that large plateau that sort of separates India and the southern region. And so let me show you what's going on here. These are elephant stables, and I'm just showing you guys this really quickly because there is a mix of Islamic influences and a mix of Indian influences. So just like what we saw in the manuscript, we're seeing something similar here. First and foremost, we see dome structures. As I mentioned, that's typical of Islamic architecture. And then over here, we have what looks to be sort of like a stepped pyramidal structure. And that reflects the Vimanas. The Vimanas are the towers in our southern temple design. Remember, they looked like step pyramids. So this here, where I have the arrow drawn, is influence of India. And over here, the dome, where I'm drawing an arrow now, is influence of Islam. You also see some Islamic influence in some of these arches as well. And we can see that on this structure. So I'm going to talk about the Lotus Mahal. This isn't in your textbook, but it's a building that I think is quite spectacular. This is in Vijayanagara, and it is in the royal section. So there's a sacred part of the city, which is religious in nature, and the buildings are religious in nature. So they carry on much of the typical Indian temple design that we learned about last week. But here in the royal area, the architecture becomes a little bit more eclectic. So for example, I'll show you the Indian influence, which is here you probably already noticed it, the stepped look, that pyramidal structure on top. So that's typical, again, of Indian architecture. The high windows, as you can see here, and the doorway, these multi-lobed doorways, that is typical of Islamic architecture. So you start to see blending and mixing of Islamic architecture, typical of what we see in mosque architecture, for example, as well as Indian influences from the architecture of the Indian religions. Nearby in Madurai, we have the Nayaks who are ruling, and this is a gopura. A gopura is the outermost gateway to a temple complex. So I'm going to show you guys the whole temple complex. This is repainted every 12 years, by the way, so it maintains its vibrant color. So these gopuras really mark entrances to the overall temple complex. Here you can see there are a number of them. There are actually 14 gopuras here that you would enter into the temple complex. The temples themselves are these small little temples with the gold tops on them. So you can see that those gopuras really are these like monuments to direct you to the temple complex. So this is Hindu. So this is Hindu in India during the rule of Islam, when Islam rules most of India. Now I want to introduce you guys to the Mughal Empire. Now the Mughal Empire can get a little complex. These are the key figures. So Mughal means Mongols, and Babur was the founder of the Mughal Empire. So he claimed that he was a descendant of Genghis Khan, who was a Mongol, but also Timur, who's a Turk. So that means we're going west of India, northwest of India, into like Turkey, for example. He was succeeded by his son Humayun, and Humayun has a fascinating story, and that is he was in exile for 15 years in the Iranian court. So what happens basically is he had a competitor who wrestled control of Delhi, and Humayun then sought sanctuary in the court of Shah Tahmasp, and was in exile there for 15 years. When he went back to reconquer Delhi, he actually brought 2 Persian artists from the Safavid court, or the Safavid dynasty. He brought 2 of their artists back to India with him. Okay, so basically you have this guy who founds the Mughal Empire. They are Islamic, so Babur is Islamic. Humayun comes along, but he is exiled for 15 years. He ends up bringing Persian artists back with him into India. So we start to see very strong Persian influence. Humayun's son is Akbar, and Akbar had 3 key sons, he had a son and grandson and great-grandson as well: Jahangir, Shah Jahan, and Alamgir. Akbar was extraordinarily tolerant, and if you guys have been listening to my videos, you know I make note of that when we have somebody who is very tolerant, because artwork develops and flowers during that time period. If you guys remember King Kanishka, right? He was tolerant of people with different ideas. He was a foreigner ruling in India, and so we start to see images of Buddha develop as a human, for example. So there's greater tolerance to new or different things. That also happened under Akbar, okay? And then slowly through his son and his grandson and his great-grandson, Alamgir was not very tolerant at all, and actually was one of the main reasons for the Mughal dynasty to come to an end. And then Mughal rule was officially over by 1858, and this has a lot to do with the arrival of the Europeans as well. So that's what we're about to tackle now. So here we go. So the Mughal art that we most focus on are the miniatures. And miniatures relates to small manuscript painting, and it also connects to color that is used in these manuscripts. But I'm going to first talk about this one that was completed under Humayun. It's a depiction of Humayun and his brothers in a landscape. And what we see here is really a strong Persian influence. Remember, this is the guy who was in exile for 15 years, and he really enjoyed the miniatures of the Persian court, and he had 2 Persian artists come back to India with him. So what we're seeing here, typical of Persian manuscript, is something called stacked perspective. And this is where you have, the foreground depicted here, the middle ground depicted as we go up, and the distance in the background depicted higher up. But it doesn't have that natural depth of space that we normally see in like a European image. So think of this: if you guys were standing in the middle of a roadway and you look off to the distance, it looks like that road is coming to a point. When artists are able to take that technique to make their 2-dimensional flat paintings look like they have depth of space, where lines all recede towards a vanishing point, like how we see the real natural world around us, that's very European. What we're looking at here with what we call stacked perspective is Persian. So it's stacked. Instead of going back deep into space, it's just going up. Another thing you might notice are the shapes of the trees and the plants and the rocks. They have these really interesting shapes and colors as well. So that shape and color design, I showed it to you on the white div painting as well. We see it there. But this is Persian influence. So I'm going to show you an actual Persian manuscript. So this is an actual Persian manuscript. It also has stacked perspective and fanciful shapes and colors of the various parts of nature and rocks. Okay, so this, again, Persian, this completed in India under a ruler who really, really liked Persian manuscript painting and had 2 Persian artists in his court. Okay, now Humayun's son is Akbar. Now, Akbar took over rule when he was 14 years old. Now, just stop and think about it. What do 14-year-old boys generally like? They like to play. They like action. When you tell them a story, they don't want to hear a boring story. They want to hear an action-packed story. So when I lecture about this in class, when I'm in a classroom, I usually am talking about Action Akbar, because manuscripts made under Akbar are action-packed, which fits the context of what 14-year-old boys want, right? So this is actually part of a page from his story, his life story. So stories of these kings, like we saw in Iran, extend here to our Mughal rulers in India. This is when Akbar jumps on a wild elephant named Hawaii, and he pits it against another wild elephant, and as they're running over this pontoon bridge, the bridge starts to sink. You can see the floaty pontoons coming out. You also see these boats that look like they're about to go underwater. It's stacked perspective, as I mentioned to you guys. So what's happening in the distance is really high up, more so than, great depth of space, although some of those figures are shown smaller. So there's a bit of mix there, a little bit of European influence here, but mostly it's stacked perspective. And then I love some of the anecdotal details. I think your book talks about these details. Like this guy here who's trying to control his boat, like he's trying to move and shift his weight around, for example. So really sort of neat little details that are shown in this otherwise action-packed manuscript page for Akbar. Here's another work of art by Akbar, and hopefully at this point, now that I've given you guys a couple of examples, you might notice the landscape that's depicted here has those colors typical of Iranian manuscripts and shapes that are typical of Iranian shapes from the Iranian manuscripts as well. So this was made under the patronage of Akbar. So Akbar was the patron. He's the one who paid for this and asked for this particular type of artwork. Now what we see here is the subject matter, and that is Krishna holds up Mount Govardhan to shelter the villagers of Braj. This is a story of Krishna. Do you guys remember who Krishna was? Krishna is the avatar or the incarnation of Vishnu. Vishnu was one of the main Hindu gods. So here you have an Islamic ruler where you can only believe in one god who is paying to have a manuscript created that shows one of the pagan gods of Hinduism. So just think about that. And this is again Akbar's tolerance that I mentioned. He was determined to learn about other religions, and we know he invited religious practitioners from other religions to his court and discussed things like Christianity and Hinduism. And this all occurred while he was himself Islamic. So this is one of those moments of extreme tolerance of one of our rulers, and we see great works of art develop at this time. Akbar's son is Jahangir, and this work of art that I'm showing you is not in your book, but I think it's really important. It's Sahifa Banu. This is actually a female artist. This was a woman, princess in the court of Jahangir. Now, female artists aren't unheard of. They were rare, don't get me wrong, they were very rare, but they weren't unheard of. And here, Sahifa Banu, what she does is she's making a commentary, or she's celebrating Shah Tahmasp. Remember, Shah Tahmasp is the one who helped Humayun out while he was in exile for those 15 years. Now, in this image, stylistically, we are seeing two perspectives at once. So we're looking straight on at Shah Tahmasp, but we're also looking at the carpet he sits on as though we're above the carpet looking down. She did not paint this in your typical Western style perspective. It is a foreign perspective for Westerners, but this is her way of trying to convey the intricacies of that mat that he's on, or that carpet that he's on, without distorting it, trying to do something with perspective. So the European influence does come in, but not quite, not yet. So let's talk about when the European influence comes in. So under Jahangir, we do have this page completed by an artist named Bichter. This is Jahangir preferring a Sufi sheikh to kings. So really, this is a commentary on the spiritual, of his interest in spiritual over worldly powers. A Sufi sheikh is like a mystic saint. So let me show you guys what we're looking at. So here in the middle is Jahangir. He has behind him this sun and crescent moon, which act like a halo. So it really makes him the focus or the emphasis of this work of art. He is seated on an hourglass, sort of like the sands of time. And then down below are two little Cupid figures who are clothed. Those Cupid figures are European. That's an influence from Europe. And they're inscribing on this hourglass Jahangir's wish to live for 1,000 years. We have two other Cupids up top, again, very European. You might see something like this in a painting by Raphael or something. And then over here, we have a Turkish sultan, so a ruler. We have King James I of England, and then the artist is depicted. So again, Jahangir here with this mystic saint, he's putting spiritual powers over worldly powers. Worldly powers would be these figures, specifically the two kings down below. You also see, it looks like there's some sort of flooring that we're actually looking at it from the top. Again, you can see that that Western perspective is not used. So although we have Western figures like King James I and Cupids, we are seeing stylistically still some of the characteristics that we see in Persian/Indian manuscript pages at this time. Here's another page of Jahangir's. Here we actually see the arrival of a Jesuit. Jesuit is a Catholic figure from Europe. Here I'm circling him. He sort of stands out amongst the other figures that are depicted as Islamic individuals in India. Jahangir is shown up here up at top, and in this particular image, he's actually talking to his son. And his son is none other than Shah Jahan. So here's a manuscript page for Shah Jahan. Now, Shah Jahan, if you guys are familiar with, he's the one who built the Taj Mahal. He built this for his favorite wife, Mumtaz Mahal, and it is actually a mausoleum. So, as the story goes, her body was laid to rest here, and then his body was laid to rest afterwards. On a side note, I'm not going to get into it today, but there is some controversy if their bodies are actually here. But this is a monumental tomb, okay? And we don't see monumental tombs in Buddhism or in Hinduism. So here in India, the Taj Mahal is a mausoleum, a monumental tomb for Mumtaz Mahal, and then later on Shah Jahan. So it's typical of Islamic tradition. Going back to his manuscript page, this is very typical of Shah Jahan and how he was portrayed. They are much more formal. So where you have Action Akbar and then Jahangir, you see it gets a little more formal, but there's a lot of different elements in his manuscript pages. Now when we get to Shah Jahan, they're very formal. He's shown in strict profile. He's shown as an equestrian sitting on a horse, for example. And so it becomes more formal. And then that's the interior, by the way, where their bodies are resting. Another image here is Europeans bring gifts to Shah Jahan. Again, Shah Jahan's painting, very formal. It's very symmetrical. Imagery on both sides are very similar. You might notice we're looking, again, down at a carpet as though we're directly straight above it. And then we're also looking straight on in profile at our figure, Shah Jahan. So not all that realistic. We do start to see a bit of realism in the architecture up here. If we were to follow, here, I'll do it over here. If we were to follow these lines, we'd have to make them. That's pretty severe, but there would be a vanishing point that those would go to. Now down here, you might notice Europeans. They look different, and they actually are carrying objects that originated in Japan, actually. So this speaks to the arrival of Europeans. Europeans start to explore, and Europeans are traveling, and they eventually settle in India. The Dutch, the French, the British, they all start colonies in India. And with the arrival of Europeans, of course, come European influences. And so this is a manuscript page, the end of the 16th century. It's called Deposition from the Cross. Now stop and think about what we've talked about so far. We've talked about Buddhism, Hinduism, and Jainism, of course, as well. Although Jainism isn't an overly populated religion. And then I introduced you to Islam, which is the belief in one God. And now we're looking at a Christian image, which is also the belief in one God. And so now you have Western European subject matter, Christ on the cross, showing up in India. We also have some European style where you're not seeing stacked perspective the way you saw it in the Persian manuscripts. There's not exactly great depth of space conveyed here, but you can see figures in the background are here as though they naturally progress in space the way we would naturally see it. Your book talks about how this painting is thought to be a copy of a painting or an engraving by Raphael. And this is that engraving by Raphael here. So how do we get European influence in India? It arrives via the Europeans that came here. One other thing that would be European that I haven't really mentioned in any of the other earlier images, and that is something that we call shading. It's a value change. So value is one of those elements of art. Value refers to the lightness and darkness of a color, and that basically creates volume. So figures start to look like they have great volume. You can start to see depictions of anatomy very carefully. They're not just outlined. Now we're actually seeing like the internal shapes of muscles, for example. You might see some of that here in Christ's arm, for example. So strong European influence. Now, finally, I want to talk about really quickly two other locations, Rajasthan and the Punjab Hills. These are two areas in northern India on the outskirts of India that remained Hindu. And so although Islam spreads through most of India, as we know, we have, of course, New Delhi, which I pointed out earlier, and it spreads, and eventually they conquer Vijayanagara. Now I'm talking about these two regions where the Hindu court still reigned supreme. So I'm going to show you guys some paintings. I'm not going to show you guys architecture in this particular lecture today, but I'm going to show you paintings from what we call the Rajput courts and the Pahari courts. Now, I'm going to show you this image first and foremost. Really popular subject for the Rajput courts was Krishna. So here we're looking at Krishna, and if you guys remember, Krishna is the blue-skinned sheep herder. Here he's depicted right here. And he's surrounded by all of these ladies. And over here is his lover. This is his lover, Radha. And she's peeking through, it looks like she's peeking through bushes, and it's as if she's jealous. And the way that the artist is conveying her jealousy is by the background color. You'll notice there's a color blue behind her. And so that's supposed to symbolize maybe her mood is not as happy as the red, which sort of has this sexualized excitement to it, sort of enhancing the flirting that Krishna is participating in. Now, stylistically, it looks like those early Jain manuscripts we looked at last week. It also looks like some of the influences that lingered on that I talked about earlier in this lecture, with the red background, with the eye that is staring straight out at us. We're looking at these figures in profile, but the eye is looking at us straight on, which is not natural to see bodies and faces in this depiction. And then the last image I have for you guys today is again another image of Krishna and Radha. This is in a pavilion. You start to see a little bit of that European perspective with lines that recede to the distance here. And that gives us a sense that there's depth of space. And even the way that the columns are positioned to give us a sense that there is depth of space here. Remember, in those earlier images, when we look at carpets, for example, it's like we're looking at them as though we're hovering directly above them, right? So it's awkward. This is a little bit more natural. This shows us, of course, Krishna, the blue-skinned sheep herder, and his lover, Radha. I like this image because of these strong contrasts of color. You have the night sky, and it looks like there's like some type of lightning bolt that comes through the top. And so basically, this has this sort of, again, this like sexual energy, this sexual energy that we saw actually back in the temples from Khajuraho, if you guys remember those from last week. So very typical of India, and very typical of Hinduism as well. Okay, guys, that's all I have for you today. Eventually, what happens, I should mention to you guys, is the British arrive and they establish rule in India. We will pick up on that part of the class later on when we do our modern and contemporary art of India. So this is the final discussion on India for this moment. We come back to it, but we finish with the arrival of the Persian court and Islam in India, and then also those lingering areas where Hinduism still prevails, and then eventually the British arrive. Next week, we will be embarking on China, so that'll be a lot of fun. As always, if you have questions, let me know. My email door is always open. Thanks for listening, guys. Talk to you later. Bye.